Elena kept replaying the moment the wine slipped from her hand, as if her mind refused to let her forget the exact second everything shifted. She hadn't meant for it to happen. She hadn't even been looking at the glass when it tilted. But the instant the red streak touched Dante's white suit, Elena felt something inside her collapse. Fear, embarrassment, and something else she didn't want to name. She expected anger, expected the coldness men like him were known for. Instead, Dante looked at her with a quiet smile that felt far too controlled, far too calm, far too dangerous. "Now you owe me dinner," Dante murmured. No threat, no judgment, just a simple statement that punched softly and yet deeply. Elena felt her pulse jump in a way she immediately tried to blame on panic, not him. She should have apologized and walked away. She should have put walls up, not let them crack. But guilt crept around her ribs, tightening until resistance felt impossible. When she agreed to the dinner, Elena told herself it meant nothing, just repayment, just politeness, just something small. But the moment Dante sat across from her, watching her like he was reading lines, she didn't speak aloud. She knew she was wrong. Nothing about him was small. Not the way he listened, not the way his silence felt heavy, not the way she kept wondering what he was thinking. She tried to breathe through the discomfort, but every second felt like being pulled into something she wasn't ready for. Dante's voice was smooth, almost soft when he spoke, and Elena hated how much it affected her. "You're nervous," he observed gently. "I spilled wine on you," she muttered, trying to keep herself detached. "Anyone would be." "Not like this," Dante replied. "Not with me." His certainty made something twist inside her. She wanted to deny it, wanted to pretend that she wasn't responding to every word he said, but her body betrayed her. Every emotion she tried to hide surfaced the moment his eyes lingered too long. She kept telling herself she wouldn't fall into his orbit, but he pulled her in without touching her. The dinner unfolded like a slow unraveling. Dante asked questions she didn't want to answer, watched every flicker of her expression as if he was studying her more than he was speaking to her. Elena felt the space around her shrinking, not in a way that suffocated, but in a way that made her too aware of herself, aware of him, aware of the strange balance between fear and curiosity growing inside her. And then Dante said words that stopped everything. "You should know someone was following you earlier." The air inside her chest tightened. Every muscle pulled inward. "What? Why?" He didn't flinch. "I don't know yet." But Elena saw something in his eyes, control, confidence, tension, and she suddenly wasn't sure if he was warning her, protecting her, or quietly claiming her without asking permission. Her thoughts tangled. Her breath felt unsteady. She didn't want to depend on him, didn't want to feel safer because he said she should. Yet the truth was undeniable. When Dante said he was aware of someone following her, a part of her, small but powerful, leaned into the idea that she mattered to him. The shift terrified her. The night should have ended there, but Dante leaned closer, voice lower. "Elena, if something worries you, you tell me." She didn't know how to respond. She didn't know how to breathe under the weight of his attention. She didn't even know why her chest tightened with something that wasn't fear anymore. She just felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be in years. So she pulled back, just a little, enough for Dante to notice, enough for him to go quiet, enough for her heart to beat in places she didn't want him to see. The silence between them felt like a question neither wanted to answer. Hours later, when she finally found space to breathe, she overheard something that shattered everything she'd been trying to hold together. A whisper from someone outside the restaurant, a name she recognized, Dante's, and a short sentence that shouldn't have existed. "He told me to keep an eye on her." The follower wasn't after her. He wasn't there because Elena was in danger. He was connected to Dante. Her stomach dropped. Her skin went cold. Everything tangled and broke at once. She turned back into the restaurant, eyes finding Dante immediately. The look on his face, surprise, something close to regret, only made it worse. "You knew," Elena whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "You made me believe he was after me." "Elena, listen." But she was already pulling away. "I trusted you for 1 second. That was too much." She left before Dante could finish his sentence, before her resolve cracked, before her heart could betray her again. She didn't look back, but she felt his gaze lingering on her long after she stepped outside. The distance she created should have brought relief, should have helped her breathe, should have silenced the parts of her that had softened too quickly. Instead, every hour apart from him felt heavier. Every attempt to forget his voice failed. Every memory of the dinner pressed against her ribs with a tenderness she couldn't explain. She hated that she missed the intensity he carried. She hated that she kept wondering what he meant to say before she walked away. She hated that her anger wasn't strong enough to drown out the longing. And Dante, somehow she knew he wasn't done. Not with the guilt he carried, not with the truth he tried to tell her, not with the connection that neither of them chose, but both of them felt. Elena could pretend she didn't care. She could fight the pull. She could tell herself he was wrong for her, dangerous, impossible. But deep down, buried beneath fear and frustration, she knew the real reason she walked away wasn't betrayal. It was the terrifying truth that falling for him was already happening, and she didn't know how to stop it. Dante wasn't finished. He never had been. Elena didn't understand why her breath caught the moment the wine slipped from her fingers. It happened too fast to stop, but slow enough for her mind to brace for the impact of Dante's anger. Instead, Dante looked at her with a soft laugh, the kind that shouldn't have belonged to a man with his reputation. The curve of his mouth disarmed her more than fury ever could. Elena felt her spine stiffen in confusion, as if her body refused to admit that relief washed through her. She hated that feeling, hated that the wrong reaction struck first. She didn't know why she looked at his smile longer than she should have. Dante leaned in, his voice low, almost amused. "Dinner. You owe me that much." Elena felt something shift inside her. Annoyance, sharp, stubborn, rose immediately, but tangled beneath it was something she didn't want to acknowledge. She tried to convince herself it was irritation at his arrogance, but the truth was quieter and far more dangerous. She felt pulled to him, to the gentleness he shouldn't have shown. She told herself she would repay him and leave it behind. Nothing more. No space for curiosity, no room for something she refused to name. But dinner didn't go the way she expected. From the moment Dante sat across from her, his attention settled over her like a quiet storm. Elena felt it in the pauses, in the way he watched her reactions, in the subtle shifts of his expression when she avoided his gaze. His questions were too pointed, too specific for a man who claimed not to know her. The awareness unsettled her. She tried to keep her answers plain, distant, safe. But every time she thought she'd re-established emotional distance, Dante said something soft that unraveled her composure. Elena hated the effect he had on her. Her heart betrayed her constantly, speeding at his tone, stuttering at his silences. His presence felt like pressure she didn't know how to navigate. She felt like she was losing ground one breath at a time. She told herself she didn't want him to see her so clearly, but he already did. She felt it. Every time his eyes moved to her, something inside her tightened, as if bracing for truths that didn't belong to him. Their friction built slowly, silently. Neither acknowledged the tension, but it grew with every shared breath. Elena felt it in the way her thoughts tangled, in the way her body betrayed her with small signs she wished he couldn't read. She didn't want a connection. She didn't want interest. She didn't want anything from a man like Dante. Yet she felt the pull anyway. Dante didn't speak often, but when he did, his words felt deliberate. He watched her with a quiet understanding, as if he saw pieces she tried to keep buried. Elena tried to ignore the warmth that stirred each time he softened for her. She tried to deny the way guilt and longing occasionally brushed together inside her, creating something she didn't want to feel. But everything changed when Dante finally spoke the truth he had been holding back. The shift in his expression warned her first. The heaviness in his voice confirmed the rest. "Elena," he said gently, "I know who you really are." Her pulse stilled. Her thoughts stopped. Something inside her clenched painfully. She tried to breathe, but her chest wouldn't move. Dante didn't hesitate. "I know you're hiding from something, someone, a past you never told anyone." Her world tilted. Cold clarity cut through her, sharp and merciless. He knew. He knew things she never shared, things no one should know. And he had been pretending, asking questions he already had answers to, watching her like he was waiting to see when she would break. A hollow ache spread through her chest. "How long have you known?" "Long enough," Dante said softly. Too softly. Elena stood before he could say more. She didn't want to hear it. She didn't want to give him the chance to twist the knife deeper with explanations that wouldn't matter. Her trust snapped in one motion, clean, complete, devastating. "I should have known," Elena whispered, trying not to let her voice shake. "You don't get close without a reason." "Elena, let me explain." But she couldn't listen. If she did, she was afraid his voice would weaken her, or worse, make her believe him. She walked away before his words could reach her, before her heart could betray her again. She didn't look back, not even once, even though every step felt heavier than the last. Separation should have brought relief. It should have calmed her pulse, steadied her thoughts, protected her heart. But the quiet only made things louder. Every memory they shared replayed with a clarity she didn't want. His smile, his gentleness, the way he listened, the way he looked at her like she mattered. She kept seeing the moment he admitted the truth, and her chest ached with a sharpness that made no sense. She barely knew him. She shouldn't be hurt, but she was. Deeply. The more distance she created, the more she realized how deeply he'd reached into her walls without her noticing. She kept wondering why he learned her past. She kept trying to decide whether he did it because he was dangerous or because something about her mattered to him before she even realized it. Elena tried to convince herself that Dante only wanted understanding as leverage, but her memories argued differently. His softness argued differently. The pain she felt argued differently. And somewhere beneath all the hurt, she felt the truth she didn't want to say aloud. Dante had seen her. Not the version she presented, not the fragments she controlled. He saw the parts she hid, and she didn't know whether to fear that or need it. The ending was coming. She felt it in the heaviness lodged in her chest, in the questions she couldn't silence, in the way his absence felt more suffocating than his presence ever had. Wherever Dante was, she knew one thing with aching certainty. This wasn't finished. Not for her, not for him, not for whatever was forming between them, quiet, dangerous, undeniable. Elena felt the heat crawl up her neck the second the wine stained Dante's suit. She barely understood how it happened. One slip, one startled breath, one impossible moment that should have ended in anger. But Dante didn't react the way any man would have. He simply looked at her, the corner of his mouth lifting in a quiet smile that didn't match the situation at all. There was no irritation, no edge of warning in his eyes, only something steady, something unsettling, something that made Elena's stomach tighten with a confusion she didn't want to feel. "You'll repay me with dinner," Dante said, gentle but certain, as if the decision was already made. Something in his tone made refusal impossible, yet Elena tried anyway. Her resistance rose instinctively, a protective wall she'd built long before this night. She didn't want to owe him anything. She didn't want to be pulled into the orbit of a man who seemed too calm, too sure, too knowing. But when she opened her mouth, all she managed was a fractured, "That's not necessary." "It is to me," Dante said softly. And that was the beginning of the imbalance she didn't know how to step out of. Dinner felt like a trap wrapped in warmth, a moment she should have avoided but found herself unable to escape. From the second she sat across from him, Elena felt an energy she couldn't explain. Dante didn't rush her, didn't push. He simply watched her with a precision that was almost disarming. It wasn't scrutiny, it was understanding. He paid attention to details she didn't think anyone noticed. The way she exhaled too sharply when nervous. The way she touched her wrist when trying to hide anxiety. The way her voice softened when she wasn't guarding herself. Dante's awareness unsettled Elena, but what unsettled her more was how safe she felt beneath that awareness. Safe, when she should have felt endangered. Understood, when she barely understood herself. She kept trying to rebuild the emotional distance she always relied on. She told herself she wasn't going to let a stranger, especially a man like Dante, slip past her guard. She told herself the tension in her chest was irritation, not curiosity. But every subtle shift in his voice stirred something she had locked away, something she hadn't felt in years, something dangerously close to longing. Dante asked simple questions, but they landed too close to her truths. He wasn't prying. He was reading. And Elena couldn't decide if she should get up and walk away or sit still and let herself unravel. The closer the conversation drifted, the more Elena felt herself slipping into a territory she didn't understand. Dante leaned forward a little, eyes steady. "You're not used to anyone noticing you," he said quietly. Her breath caught. "I don't need to be noticed." "I didn't say you did. I said you aren't used to it." Elena felt a crack deep inside her, one she didn't want him to see. She didn't want him to know how right he was. She didn't want him to understand her that easily. But Dante already did. And then came the moment that broke everything open. Dante's expression shifted, just a fraction, but enough to warn her, enough for her pulse to tighten. "Elena," he murmured, "there's something I should tell you." She didn't move, didn't blink, couldn't breathe. "I've noticed you before tonight," he confessed, "weeks ago." The air inside her felt sharp, painful. Why? His silence told her everything. Long before the wine spill, long before she knew his name, long before any of this, Dante had watched her, not in malice, not in obsession, but in a quiet, contained certainty that somehow felt worse. Elena felt her chest tighten with a heartbreak she hadn't prepared for. "So this wasn't chance," she whispered. "It wasn't," Dante admitted, voice low. She didn't yell. She didn't demand explanations. She simply pushed her chair back, the motion small but filled with a weight she couldn't hide. She felt tricked, played, drawn into closeness she never consented to. "I don't know what you want from me," Elena said quietly, "but whatever it is, I can't give it." "Elena." "Don't." Her voice trembled. "Please don't say anything else." She walked away with her heart aching, with her chest tight, with her thoughts spiraling into places she didn't want to revisit, but she didn't look back. She couldn't. The separation should have been a relief. It wasn't. Every hour afterward felt too loud, too heavy. She kept replaying the night, replaying his voice, replaying the gentle way he spoke her name. She felt the connection she tried so hard to deny, tightening around her instead of fading. Elena couldn't understand why she cared. She barely knew him. She shouldn't feel betrayed. She shouldn't feel anything. And yet, every time she closed her eyes, she saw the softness he tried to hide beneath his calm exterior. She remembered the way he listened to her, the way he saw her, the way she felt something shift inside her when he did. She realized, slowly, painfully, that she'd let him too close far too quickly, and now she couldn't unfeel any of it. Her chest stayed too tight, her thoughts stayed too loud, and the hardest truth of all settled into her bones. Connection wasn't something she chose with him, it simply happened. Quietly, inevitably, undeniably. And now, no matter how hard she tried to build distance, Dante was still there. In the back of her mind, in the ache beneath her ribs, in the feelings she wasn't ready to admit. Their confrontation was coming. It would be messy. It would be raw. It would be everything she'd been avoiding. But Elena already knew. He wasn't done with her, and she wasn't done with him. Elena didn't understand how a single moment could collapse her balance so completely. One slip of her hand, one splash of red across Dante's immaculate suit, and her breath had frozen in her chest. She waited for anger, for the kind of sharp reaction men like him were known for. But Dante only looked at her with a slow, deliberate smirk that made the back of her neck grow warm with confusion, not fear. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He simply murmured, "Dinner will settle it." Like the words were already binding something between them she hadn't agreed to. Elena tried to protest, but his gaze held her too firmly, too knowingly, as if he could already see the conflict rising inside her. She wasn't afraid of the stain on his suit. She was afraid of the calm he carried, the kind that made her feel unsteady in ways she couldn't explain. When she finally muttered, "You don't need repayment," Dante only smiled slightly, and that smile worked its way beneath her ribs like a quiet claim she wasn't ready for. She didn't mean to accept the dinner, but her refusal kept dissolving every time she met his eyes. By the time she found herself sitting across from him, she hated how aware she was of every breath, every pause, every measured question he asked. Dante didn't interrogate her. He studied her. The way her voice dipped when she talked about her past, the way her fingers tightened around her fork when she tried to hide discomfort, the way she hesitated before answering anything personal. He didn't push, yet somehow he still reached places she'd worked years to keep closed. Elena tried to keep her guard intact, telling herself silently over and over that she wasn't going to be pulled into anything unfamiliar or dangerous. She didn't know him. She didn't understand what he wanted. And the more gently he looked at her, the more she wanted to step away before she fell into something she couldn't climb out of. But then Dante would say something unexpectedly soft. "You don't owe me fear, Elena." And her chest would tighten in ways she didn't want to acknowledge. She didn't know what startled her more, that he used her name like it belonged to him, or that she didn't correct him. The longer they spoke, the more she felt her resolve bending. Dante wasn't charming. He wasn't trying to be. He was simply steady, quietly attentive, and somehow that made everything more dangerous. She could feel the emotional tension curling between them, growing heavier every time their eyes met for a second too long. She wanted to look away. She didn't. But then the shift came, the moment that shattered her fragile sense of control. Dante's voice dropped, his expression tightening just enough for her to notice. "There's something you should know," he said, and Elena felt her stomach tense before he even finished. "Your brother crossed someone he shouldn't have." Her heartbeat stuttered painfully. "What do you mean?" she whispered, though a deep part of her already knew this wouldn't be something she could easily swallow. Dante's next words weren't softened, weren't wrapped in the same gentleness he'd shown all night. "He crossed my organization." Her world tilted too fast. She couldn't breathe. She didn't even hear anything after that, only felt the weight of betrayal crashing through her chest. Every moment from dinner twisted into something darker. Every quiet smile, every attentive look, every softened word. She replayed them instantly, convinced now they hadn't been genuine. He had needed something from her. He had hidden things from her. He had manipulated her without raising his voice or lifting a hand. "You used me," she managed, her voice barely steady. "You knew who I was. You knew, and you didn't tell me." Dante tried to speak, but she stepped back, unable to let him explain. The pain in her chest wasn't just betrayal. It was the humiliating realization that she had let him close enough to hurt her in the first place. She walked away from him, each step feeling heavier than the last. Elena didn't remember leaving the restaurant. She only remembered the way Dante watched her as she did, Not chasing her, not calling out, just standing there with an expression she didn't want to decipher. She told herself she didn't care. She told herself she was done. But her voice kept breaking inside her head, ruining every attempt at numbness. The days that followed stretched painfully slow. Elena tried to bury every thought of Dante, but he lingered like a bruise she kept touching to check if it still hurt. And it did. Her chest tightened whenever she remembered the way he had looked at her. Not like a man using her, but like someone who couldn't step back even when he should. She hated that part the most because it made everything confusing. What if his actions hadn't been manipulation? What if they had been something else entirely? Something he didn't know how to express without turning it into a mess? Elena replayed his warning, the tension in his voice, the subtle worry she now recognized but hadn't understood then. He hadn't told her to scare her. He'd told her because he thought she deserved to know. The truth hit slowly, painfully. Dante had been protecting her, even if he'd done it in the most complicated way possible. Realization settled inside her like a quiet ache she couldn't ignore. She wasn't angry anymore. She was afraid of how much she'd felt, of how easily he had shaken her carefully built boundaries, of how deeply she wanted answers she wasn't sure she deserved. Nights stretched with thoughts of the way he'd looked at her, the softness beneath the hardness, the hesitation in his voice when he tried to warn her. Dante had been careful with her, too careful for a man with his reputation. And that confused tenderness was what kept her awake, replaying memories she wanted to forget, but couldn't. She didn't know how the confrontation would unfold when it finally happened. She only knew it was coming. Inevitable. Heavy. Unfinished. She wasn't prepared for what she felt. She never had been. But Elena understood one thing with painful clarity. Whatever existed between them hadn't ended the night she walked away. It had only begun unraveling, and neither she nor Dante could pretend otherwise anymore. Elena froze the moment the red wine slipped from her grasp, spilling across Dante's immaculate suit. Her chest tightened, fear clawing at her throat. She had imagined rage, maybe a sharp word, an explosion of anger that would leave her quaking in apology. But Dante didn't move. He didn't snap or curse. Instead, there was a slow, quiet smile that made her pulse spike in a way she couldn't reconcile with logic. "Dinner, as repayment," he said, voice low and steady, as though the words themselves carried weight heavier than the stain. Something in the calmness, the certainty behind that smile, made her stomach twist. She wanted to pull back, to erase the moment entirely, but curiosity tethered her to the table where he waited, composed, watching. Sitting across from him, Elena's defenses refused to cooperate. Every word Dante spoke, every slight tilt of his head, seemed precise, intentional. But there was something raw beneath it, something that teased the edges of her control. She tried to distract herself, to focus on the meal, on anything other than the tension coiling in her chest, but each glance at him stole her breath. His questions weren't casual. They probed just enough to unsettle her, to make her consider revealing more than she intended. "Do you always carry yourself like that?" she asked, her voice betraying the edge of fascination she refused to name. He chuckled softly, almost indulgently, and for a moment the world contracted to the space between them. She could feel the magnetism she tried to deny, tugging relentlessly at her reason. By the middle of the dinner, Elena realized Dante's attention wasn't merely polite, it was consuming. He listened with an intensity that unsettled her, yet the curiosity in his eyes was accompanied by restraint, almost respect. She hated how much it affected her, hated the heat rising to her cheeks when his hand brushed hers for a fraction of a second. Why does he make it so hard to hate him? She wondered, heart thudding against her ribs, mind spinning. She fought against it, reminding herself of the danger, the unknown, the menacing calm in Dante's presence. She told herself he was trouble, a storm she didn't want to stand in, but her pulse betrayed her intentions, hammering like a drum she couldn't silence. Then came the revelation that shattered the fragile balance. Elena's eyes widened as Dante confessed he had dismissed one of his men that night, not for insubordination, not for failure, but because the man had threatened her. She recoiled internally, the collision of fear and relief leaving her breathless. Protective, dangerous, unpredictable. Which was he? Her mind spun with conflicting emotions. How could someone capable of such lethal control also harbor this inexplicable tenderness? She wanted to trust, but every fiber screamed caution. She excused herself abruptly, standing too quickly, heart hammering with the weight of unanswered questions, leaving the dinner unfinished and her emotions raw. The walk away from him felt like walking through fire she didn't deserve to touch. Elena's mind replayed every smile, every touch, every calculated pause in his speech. She hated how much she wanted to analyze him, to linger on the edges of what he revealed. She convinced herself distance would restore her control, her autonomy. But the hollow echo of his presence followed her. She realized she hadn't just spilled wine on his suit. She had allowed him to penetrate her carefully constructed emotional boundaries. And now, removed from his proximity, the emptiness pressed down, sharpening the realization that she cared. More than she should, more than she was willing to admit. In the following days, Elena couldn't escape Dante. He lingered in her thoughts, in the heat that rose without warning, in the pang of longing when she remembered the weight of his gaze. Her attempts at emotional armor faltered each time she thought of him. She wondered whether he had intended to unsettle her, to test her resilience, or if the connection they shared, accidental, dangerous, electrifying, was genuine. The ambiguity tormented her, a delicate tension she didn't know how to untangle. Did he really care? She questioned in the quiet of her mind, heart aching with uncertainty. When she finally confronted the memory, she remembered his smile, not as smugness, but as something disarmingly soft, something that had invited her into the unknown. The pull between them was undeniable, a gravity she hadn't anticipated. Elena realized the truth she'd resisted. Dante had seen her, not just the composed, guarded exterior, but the parts she kept hidden, the fear, the desire, the longing she buried beneath caution, and she had responded despite herself. The recognition left her breathless, vulnerable, and painfully aware of how much she had already lost to him emotionally. Dante's presence became an echo she couldn't ignore, each memory sharper, each imagined touch heavier. The knowledge that he had protected her, even subtly, unsettled her more than fear ever could. She despised the vulnerability she felt, hated the softness creeping into her defenses. Yet with every recollection, she felt the pull, the dangerous allure, the intoxicating chaos of needing someone she could barely understand but already couldn't resist. It terrified her, yet she felt alive in a way she hadn't before. Her mind replayed the confession, the dinner, the dismissal of his man, a protection wrapped in his own unspoken code, complex and unnerving. Eventually, Elena realized she couldn't continue running from the intensity he evoked. The denial of her feelings was an illusion, a fragile construct she could no longer uphold. She felt the trembling ache of wanting, of longing, of recognition that Dante had marked her emotions in ways irreversible. Each day apart was a lesson in restraint and failure. Every thought of him a pulse of forbidden attraction. Every memory a reminder that she had already crossed the invisible line between self-preservation and surrender. The emotional truth pressed against her chest, unrelenting, demanding acknowledgement. Finally, confrontation became inevitable. Elena returned, heart thrumming with both fear and anticipation. Dante's calm eyes met hers, unflinching, challenging, patient. Neither needed to speak initially. The weight of unspoken truths hung between them, palpable and suffocating. "You don't understand," she whispered. though she doubted even she knew what she meant. He simply regarded her, a soft intensity in his gaze that made her confess to herself what she had been denying. She cared. She cared for the man who terrified her, for the man who protected her in ways unasked, for the man who had awakened a storm within her she had spent years containing. And in that admission, raw and jagged, a connection formed, unresolved, dangerous, undeniable, a bond neither of them could pretend was accidental. In that space, charged and taut, Elena understood something profoundly unsettling, yet exhilarating. She had given Dante far more than a night, more than a dinner, more than words could measure. She had allowed herself to be seen, to be affected, to be drawn irrevocably into the orbit of someone who could destroy her or elevate her with a single look. And Dante, with that quiet, controlled smile, had already claimed the truth of her emotions without uttering a single lie. Their story, raw and unfinished, pulsed between them, an intoxicating promise of danger and desire that neither could deny, marking the beginning of a connection that would haunt and drive them in equal measure. Elena's hand shook the instant the red wine spilled across Dante's pristine white suit, her pulse hammering with the certainty of imminent fury. She braced herself for the storm she knew she deserved. Sharp words, a glare that could slice through bone, anger that would force her apologies from her trembling lips. But Dante didn't erupt. Instead, a low laugh rumbled through the space between them, casual yet threaded with something dangerous, magnetic. The curve of his mouth, the calm in his eyes, made her heart betray her caution. "You owe me dinner," he said softly, not as a demand, not even as a threat, but with a gravity that left her chest tight and her mind betraying her, calculating, resisting, yet inexplicably drawn. She wanted to step back to escape this man who unbalanced her so completely, but every instinct to flee collided with the inexplicable pull of curiosity. Dinner was supposed to be a punishment. That was Elena's mantra as she sat across from him, every nerve taut, every thought on guard. Yet Dante's questions, gentle and deliberate, cut through her defenses in ways she hadn't anticipated. He didn't just ask, he listened. Each pause and tilt of his head extracting truths she never intended to reveal. She caught herself leaning in slightly, reluctant to, yet unable to pull away. Each flicker of his expression, each subtle sound carried a weight she hadn't prepared to bear. Why did his calm unsettle her more than anger ever could? She told herself he was dangerous, a storm wrapped in control, but her pulse raced in defiance of her reason, betraying the attraction she fought to ignore. Their conversation became a battlefield of restraint. Elena tried to keep the distance that her heart screamed was necessary, yet Dante's presence, serene and unshakable, made that distance impossible. His attention was relentless but unobtrusive, a paradox she couldn't untangle. Every time their eyes met, she felt the magnetic pull of unspoken understanding and subtle mischief. She hated the truth her body whispered. She wanted him to stay, to notice, to care, even in the smallest, quietest gestures. And he did. Every tilt of his head, every measured word, conveyed that he saw her, truly saw her, in ways she had spent years denying anyone could. Then came the revelation that shattered her carefully constructed boundaries. Dante admitted he had intervened earlier that day, quietly, unseen, preventing someone from confronting her in a situation she hadn't even realized existed. Her stomach dropped, a hollow ache of betrayal and confusion gnawing at her. How had he inserted himself into her life without consent? The intimacy of his protection clashed violently with the secrecy, and the idea that he had manipulated circumstances without her knowledge left her reeling. She felt exposed, manipulated yet strangely safe, a paradox that tore at her more violently than the spilled wine ever could. Without thinking, she rose abruptly, leaving before he could soften the blow. before his calm gaze could remind her how much she had already surrendered emotionally. The separation was agonizing. Elena's chest ached with the weight of unspoken words, her thoughts replaying every detail of their encounter with excruciating clarity. She tried to rationalize the distance, insisting that keeping away from Dante was necessary for her own safety, for her sense of control. But her heart, traitorous and insistent, reminded her of the undeniable truth. He had stirred something inside her that she could not dismiss, could not ignore. She caught herself recalling the tilt of his smile, the low cadence of his laughter, the way his gaze lingered just long enough to unsettle her defenses. Each memory was a subtle torment, a reminder that her walls had already begun to crumble. In the quiet of her solitude, Elena began to confront the complexity of her emotions. Dante's presence had been intrusive, yes, but it had also been protective in ways she could not deny. He had acted, hidden, and intervened because he cared in his own intricate, perhaps flawed, way. The thought both infuriated and comforted her, igniting a storm of longing and resentment. She realized that her attempts to maintain control, to keep him at arm's length, were futile. The gravity he carried had pulled her closer than she wanted, had exposed vulnerabilities she had spent years hiding. She recognized the truth with a pang of fear and desire. She'd already given him more than she intended, and perhaps more than she could ever take back. The emotional tension grew unbearable until confrontation became inevitable. When Elena returned, tentative yet resolute, the air between them hummed with the weight of what remained unspoken. Dante's gaze held hers, steady, commanding, patient, as if he had been waiting for her to face the truth she tried to evade. "You can't just," she began, voice faltering under the intensity of what she wanted and what she feared. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer excuses. He simply watched, allowing the space for her own realization to surface fully. She saw it then, the danger intertwined with protection, the secrecy entangled with care, the undeniable fact that she cared for him, despite every warning her mind hurled at her. The acknowledgement of her feelings left Elena trembling, not from fear alone, but from the raw, aching intensity of desire and recognition. Dante's quiet patience, his restrained magnetism, drew her forward, demanded confession, demanded surrender, and yet neither of them moved too quickly. Both aware of the precarious edge they balanced on, the connection was undeniable, intoxicating, and terrifying. She understood with a clarity that was both painful and exhilarating that their lives had intersected in a way that could not be undone. She had wanted to resist, to maintain distance, but now she knew the truth. She could not unfeel what had been sparked, could not retreat from the depth of what Dante had stirred within her. Every moment following the dinner, every thought that returned to him, underscored the peril and promise of their bond. Elena realized that fear had intertwined with desire. Uncertainty had mingled with the intoxicating awareness of being seen, and Dante, calm, measured, unrelenting, had already claimed a place in her heart she hadn't intended to offer. Their connection hovered on the precipice of danger and vulnerability, a delicate, thrilling, terrifying truth neither could ignore. Elena's heartbeat quickened with the realization she was tethered to him in ways that might define her, haunt her, and perhaps, against her better judgment, save her. The air between them was charged, unresolved, a quiet storm neither could name, but both felt. Words, though sparse, carried the weight of every unspoken thought, every hidden longing, every fear masked by defiance. And in that tension, in the space that trembled with danger and desire, they faced the most raw truth. Whatever this was between them, it was already beyond control, beyond hesitation, and utterly unavoidable. The favor he had claimed that night, The dinner she never meant to accept had changed everything, and Elena understood with a bittersweet ache that life would never feel the same again.